I like the idea that Dan Andrews is prioritising jobs. I wish he'd done that towards the end of that lockdown. But the 4 Grand Slam tournaments, and he obviously has been given a bum steer, these tournaments and their locations, London, Paris, New York and Melbourne, were set in stone by the International Tennis Federation in 1924-25. And as former tennis great and Liberal MP John Alexander told us last night, that can never be changed.
We're having a major event that if we don't have it, well, somebody else will, and it won't be coming back.
Who told you that?
And I've made that, well, logic tells you that.
No, who's what credible tennis person suggested that we're at risk of losing the Australian Open as a Grand Slam event?
Well, I've had many different discussions with many different people.
Who's one?
Well, I'm not going into the private discussions that I have with people, Chip, and I'm not also going to. If I say to you that my logic tells me this, well, then that answers your question.
There's just no one that I can find in tennis that agrees that Melbourne's at risk of losing the Australian Open as a Grand Slam.
Well, again, let me just go back through this. I've done it a few times. I'll do it again. The Grand Slam status of this tournament is not part of the contract.
That is immovable history. Immovable history. So what is the urgency and fear over holding this tournament when you've got to import players, staff and their positive COVID condition from areas in the world where the virus is rampant? Back again to Chairman Dan, who awkwardly blamed his gut feeling on moving mountains to hold the Open.
If the Australian Open does not happen in Melbourne, it will happen somewhere else. It'll happen in Japan. It'll happen in China. It'll happen in Singapore. And the real risk then is it doesn't come back. It doesn't come back. So an event that underpins tens of thousands of jobs is a major part of our major events agenda, which in total terms supports more than 250,000 Victorian jobs. Not to mention the fact that we, all of us, as taxpayers, have built a facility that is second to none at roughly at about $1.5 billion worth of investment over a 10-year period. This event is very important to our city and our state.
He's extremely willing to hold the Open when most countries wouldn't even touch it. It's Dan's logic. The same logic, no doubt, that helped him install security guards in hotel quarantine, then refused to accept responsibility for it, and we know how that turned out. That's the logic that runs Victoria.
The Australian Formula One Grand Prix is set to be cancelled amid COVID uncertainty. It was scheduled to be held in Melbourne in November after being postponed earlier this year. The Australian Grand Prix was also cancelled last year, just before its start date in March. Daniel Andrews saying more people need to be vaccinated before events like the Grand Prix can go ahead.
However, just remember, it was the Victorian Premier's fear of losing the Australian Open forever that has seen him bend rules and import more of the virus to make all of this happen. He was very clear about what might happen if they postponed or cancelled the event. And that attitude has not changed one iota. In fact, today, the Chairman of Victoria, Daniel Andrews, exhibited the most hypocritical attitude we have seen during this pandemic. Here he was last week. Remember what he said, saying, we're closing in on a lockdown-free Australia.
Everyone who wants to be vaccinated has been given an opportunity to do that. And then it's on them if they don't choose to get vaccinated. But we wouldn't be having lockdowns to protect people who weren't prepared to protect themselves.
But today, well, he should have booked himself a trip to Tokyo. He did a backflip with triple pike. Victoria cans the Formula One Grand Prix in November. Now, that's November, not July. That's the month, about a month away from when everyone expects all voluntary jabs to be completed, because the racing teams would not quarantine for 2 weeks before the race.
Us not yet being at a critical mass of Victorians and Australians who've got the jab, we're a long way away from that, and the protection and the freedom and the choices and options that gives us running big international events is very, very challenging. But until that point, we have to do everything we can to safeguard not bringing the virus in.
What a load of garbage. A load of garbage. You can't run a race in a bubble the way you run the AFL. We're jabbing at almost 1 million a week. Most vulnerable people are already vaccinated. Of course they wouldn't quarantine these people. 853 million people worldwide have had the jab. Just tell the racing fraternity to make sure that come November they've all got one. Well, in fact, they can all have two. The likelihood is that by now they've all been jabbed. And yet you want to lock them up for 2 weeks beforehand in November. He beats WA's Mark McGowan now, Dan Andrews. That is grossly risk averse, flies in the face of his own plan out last week. And it also robs the state of Victoria of hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue, which they desperately need, and maybe even down the track, the right to ever hold the Grand Prix again. I said at the start of the week, the very start, it's all well and good for National Cabinet to have a plan out, but will the premiers have the guts to make their own informed decisions and not be guided by risk-averse medics? It didn't take long to get an answer on that.